Thank you, Father Manu, for those words of welcome. And thanks to Father Jose as well for this opportunity. I have been following this lecture series, the previous ones as well. And it has been an enriching experience. And I hope to share with you some of my reflections and thoughts. And I would also like to acknowledge MK George, who has inspired me and who has uh, he's the first one to introduce me to this group, and again thanks to Father Jose for this initiative. Thank you very much. And okay, now I would like to begin this presentation, Pilgrims in Uncertain Times. Okay, the Pilgrims in Uncertain Times, the spiritual orientations as the mission of church in India. The world is breathless. The world is breathless, just like George Floyd. The world is breathless with Corona and all this pandemic, the havoc that it has created. And it is true that the world is coming out of lockdown, and so is India. The people are allowed on roads. Private vehicles can ply now within the states without any hindrance, and most shops are beginning to open. The airports are humming back to life. In the gradual opening up, we know that the first thing that was permitted was the liquor shops. Very ironic, we must say. And even today, the religious places are the places of worship, and they are still shut. Does the world require a God? The entire world is looking to uncertain future. There appears no clarity in the horizon. As people of faith, we turn to God for answers, reassurance, for comfort, and so on. When all are talking of a new normal, shouldn't we be preparing for this normal? How are we going to live this normal? And as people of faith, what sort of principles can guide us? If we are talking of spirituality, what sort of spirit actuality? What sort of spirit actuality can we be talking about, except one of God-centered or spirit-centered one? My first affirmation is that it is too early to talk of a new normal, because our experience shows that we tend to go back to the old, and we do not seem to learn. We have already said in the previous speakers have highlighted. And maybe we can take the examples of floods of Uttarakhand, the recent floods in Kerala, etc. Secondly, the turmoil within the church is not caused by the COVID. Or maybe it has amplified the voice that demands change. Pandemic has not brought about this totally new things. Rather, they are happening over a period of time. New normal, what we call the new normal, has to wait because we do not know the nuances yet, though we are aware of the changes. People are eagerly waiting to return to the churches, yet there is a danger of going back to the old ruts unless guided by clear principles. Is the church in India going to return to the same novenas and age-old practices? Today, I would like to pose a few questions. What spiritual principles can help us to cope with the challenges thrown at us? In order to answer this question, we need to spell out the challenges. I would like to list a couple of them here. And the first is uncertainty. We can easily say that uncertain future awaits the world and the church. There is uncertainty over job, education, healthcare, entertainment, and even life itself. There has been persistent question, especially during this pandemic, where is God? And the churches are closed. The places of worship are not accessible to people. We have heard many voices that say that God and Godmen are over. only science is going to save the earth. The medical field is the one that is offering hope to people when God is dead. Will the role of the church be to provide a platform to address this uncertainty? I pray so. Church has to stand up to the challenge to find God, or at least help walk towards that direction. It is here that spirituality has a big role to play. Here we must recall what Pope Francis is teaching us, to keep searching for answers, even when there is great silence like that of a Holy Saturday. And we will return to Pope Francis a bit later to talk more in details. And the second challenge that is ahead of us is hopelessness. The empty churches and overflowing hospitals invariably create hopelessness. The image of ambulance, doctors and nurses struggling, hundreds of coffins lined up, or large graves certainly push us into hopelessness. Media has bombarded us with images of death and despair. Every day, the channels and websites update statistics on COVID as if it were cricket score. People are often gasping for breath amidst such suffocating news. The world is indeed breathless. The mission of the church is to provide hope in such times. The leaders have to shepherd the hapless humanity. Church in India needs to move beyond mere social involvement and light that ray of hope in thousands of hearts. And the third challenge is the unclear way or the unclear path ahead. What lies ahead after lockdown is over? Church in India is struggling to respond and the path ahead is unclear. In the last 2 months, there have been numerous online programs. There are many digital platforms to reach out to the faithful, etc. And many of the parishes have made sure that the Holy Week was indeed holy, even if they were confined to the four walls of their homes. However, the way forward is not clear. Are we going to continue as though online will take care of everything when hotline to God is what people yearn for? I'm afraid that then only the medium has changed and not the content. Many things have gone online, but the content remains exactly the same. We are not in line with the frequency of the people, the hands of people that raise to God. Maybe we are not able to support it. It is here that the church can look up to Pope Francis and learn from his spirituality, one of being a pilgrim who is ever in search. The image of Pope Francis walking down St. Peter's Square brings great consolation. Church in India has to walk many solitary squares in these uncertain times. And that prepares us to the next part of our presentation today, being a pilgrim in the troubled times of pandemic. We have outlined the challenges in front of us, and now it is about identifying spiritual principles that can guide our journey forward. I would like to call it our Emmaus in these times, when we are all tempted to say, I hope it would be, I thought he would, etc. We as body of believers need to converse about our hopes, our despairs, our disappointments, so as to identify were not our hearts on fire moments. The challenge is to be Emmaus pilgrims who find hope, find newness and enthusiasm for the mission ahead. I would like to highlight the characteristic of a pilgrim, or who is a pilgrim, so that we can understand this pilgrim spirituality that I'm talking about. Now, when we ask who is a pilgrim, is the one who decides to leave the comfort of his or her home in search of something greater, in search of the ultimate. He or she is not in control of things. There is uncertainty, and she or he has to learn to live with that, knowing that he or she is in search. Here I would like to draw your attention to the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola as an example of being a pilgrim. The unfolding of this pilgrim saint's drama begins at Pamplona. An ambitious young military man, full of zeal and loyal to the crown, fighting to defend the fort. In this foolish exhibition of courage, he is wounded, and the injured leg and shattered dream push him to uncertainty and hopelessness. In his sickbed, Inigo learns to pay attention to himself first, then his thoughts, and what he calls the interior movements, the action of God deep within his soul. He decides to follow God as he felt deep within this is a better leader. This loyalty is more exciting. Once he had decided to follow God, he was always in search, seeking to find what God had in store for him and in what way he could be sure of that. Inigo begins his pilgrimage, the search, and he traveled to the Holy Land to live and die there, and if possible, to be a martyr. But his enthusiasm was short lived, as the ecclesiastical authorities ordered him to get out. Yet Inigo did not give up his search for God. He went round to different places of education, while always in touch with the question that sprung up from his deep: what does God want of me? Inigo tried, of course, in vain to imitate other spiritual heroes like Saint Dominic, Saint Francis, etc. And then he learned that God was leading him like a schoolmaster leading a little child. Inigo by now began to develop greater awareness and sensitivity to God's ways, and he learns the first lessons of discernment to observe the thought process and in what way they influence his decision. Inigo went on to train himself after he gave up his sword, after he gave up all his belongings, so that he could help others discover God's presence and action in their life. And rest is history, as they say, how Francis Xavier and others found an answer to their deep desires. One who had to allow the mule to decide for himself went on to become a master in the art of discerning the spirit, to separate the chaff from the grain, an advocate to see the beginning, the middle, and the end of thought process, not to be deceived by wolf in a sheep skin or under the appearance of good. Towards the end of his life, Inigo, or Ignatius, was able to say that he was always growing in devotion, that is, facility in finding God. And now more than ever in his whole life, and every time and every hour he wanted to find God, he found him. As the autobiography 99 says, Inigo the pilgrim learns to see the action of God. He is able to find God and discern his will. Well, then, looking at life as a pilgrim implies readiness to leave the comfort zone. A pilgrim is not the one to settle for things on the way. He or she has to follow his goal. We have seen that Ignatius, as a pilgrim, learned to focus on goal and not carried away by the success of his little ministry of helping others. Then, if we believe that the church in India needs to be pilgrim, then we have to keep our eyes fixed on our goal and not be distracted by many other things along the way. Seeking for God should be the primary concern then, the primary concern of all of us, all people of faith. The Shema Israel, the Deuteronomy chapter 6:4 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." As church in India, the most pressing need is to help in their search for God, or help people to walk the pilgrimage of seeking God. We have enough and more instances of people raising voices. Where is God in all these situations? And we He can no longer ignore it. Let me come back to Pope Francis. The image of him leading the world in prayer in the thick of pandemic, when all around Rome there was despair and desperation and gloom. On that rainy evening when Pope walked down the Vatican Square, all alone in that deafening silence, I think he was being a pilgrim, maybe unsure of what God was asking him, but it was quite clear message to the entire universe. In the face of uncertainty, keep your eyes fixed on God. Keep trusting, and He will show the path to walk. As I mentioned already, the pilgrim is a seeker of God and nothing else. Keeping our eyes and ears open to see and hear what we need to practice. And this is what we need to practice. Then we may ask, what do we hear and see? And how can we find God in these sufferings? The previous speakers, many have highlighted what we see and we hear. And we can ask the question, how can we find God in this suffering? More than ever, these troubled times of pandemic throw up the question, has God abandoned us? Is the church finding ways to lead people to God experience? Are we getting better and better in seeking God, or are we distracted with many other things? What needs to be asked is also the kind of God image we have been creating. Or is it like our God image, is it like a supermarket model? You can purchase commodities according to your capacity, where the consumer is the king. Maybe that is why we have different brands of spirituality and their agents trying to sell their products, many with exciting offers. A cursory analysis will show that the popular retreat centers that were frequented by thousands of people in the 90s are out of fashion now. People look for variety, the latest or the more or for more entertainment. Maybe we as church are distracted a lot, and hence we are not focusing on seeking God, but we are busy in increasing the brand value. We need to develop sensitivity to see the musings of God. If we are to find God, then we must learn to see, learn to decipher the language of God. Connected with this, of course, is the whole aspect of awareness. How aware are we of God's action and His way of communicating to us? It is easy to say, God is absent, He has abandoned, and so on. For people of faith, such answer is not the right one. We heard the other day Mr. Percival Hall talking about the desire of millennials and teens, and so that there is a deep yearning in them to be connected, to experience God, not just in the TV shows, but more tangibly. I'm pretty sure that that is not only of the youth, but this desire is of others as well. We all share in this desire. The church, you and me, have the responsibility to develop the sensitivity and sensibility of people to seek and find God in daily life events. In such a pilgrimage, we have to develop our sense of awareness of God's ways of acting in us, awareness of how God works in the world, awareness of our own helplessness and fragility, consciousness of spirit-filled life, etc. I would like to underline the fact that Ignatius, the strength of Ignatius was his acumen to observe himself and awareness of his own response to God, the subtle ways selfishness could creep into his life, and so on. As pilgrim, we need to make sure that we are not seeking ourselves but God. We are seeking to follow Him and Him alone. The practice of the examine, the daily prayer of God-centeredness, which helped Ignatius, will help us to develop awareness of God's action. And this prayer is not an exercise to count our faults, but to be aware of God's action during the day in the particular time frame of our life. And here we might be asking, how can we be sure that we are following God? Well, Pope Francis never stops surprising us. He talks of discernment time and again as a means to make choices. And I quote him here. That is right. Stay in open seas. The the Catholic must not be afraid of open seas, must not look for the shelter of safe ports. Above all, as above all, people avoid clinging to certainties and securities. The Lord calls us to go out on mission, to go out to the sea and not to go into the retirement to take care of certainties. Storms are encountered in going to sea, and there can be a headwind. And yet you always make the holy voyage in the company of Jesus, who says to his own, courage, it is I, be not afraid. This is the next principle in being a pilgrim, the practice of discernment. It is the art of choosing God amidst all sorts of choices, all kinds of noises. Discernment is a function of the Holy Spirit. It is a gift. As such, there is need to rely more on the Spirit. The mission of the church then is to sensitize the believers in getting used to the Spirit. In the same breath, I must add that not all noises come from Spirit. Not all noises, not all that we hear come from the Holy Spirit. There is a great need to learn to listen to the true Spirit, also to realize that a church, ecclesial authority, and there are many elements in this discernment process. As I said, Pope Francis has been calling for discernment. The church needs to grow in discernment, needs to grow in the capacity to discern. In life, everything is not black and white. There are gray areas, and we need to teach people to discern in such gray areas. This is from Civiltà Cattolica of 2017. And he writes again, this is the time of discernment in the church and in the world. Discernment is always realized in the presence of the Lord, looking at the signs, listening to things that happen, the feelings of people who know the humble way of the daily stubbornness, and especially of the poor. But we need to penetrate ambiguity. We need to enter in there, as the Lord Jesus did, assuming our flesh. Rigid thought is not divine because Jesus has assumed our flesh, which is not rigid except after death. End of quote. Discernment involves a lot of dialogue and sharing. We realize that there is much scope for open conversation at depth level so that the movement of spirit can be known. Discernment is like an interior eye that illumines the situation. Pilgrim spirituality, therefore, calls for decision making based on awareness and discernment. I would like to passingly comment on the blocks in this pilgrim spirituality. And we know that our tendency to go back, to remain with the familiar, this is a great block for us. We have the nostalgia of the good old days, and it is difficult to walk the unfamiliar path. But a pilgrim has to walk new terrain, of course, always ensuring that one is on the right direction. Another block that can hinder is self-righteousness and unwilling to listen. If one is so sure that one has the truth and is convinced of it after due discernment, of course, always after due discernment, it is possibly entering into, maybe we shall call it fanaticism, that one is so sure. I think closely linked to this search is another expression from Ignatian spirituality, finding God in all things. Keeping our eyes open also would mean that we look for God. And in this pandemic, during this pandemic, we are challenged to find God, even in this situation of helplessness. Now, summing up what I have been saying, we are looking at an unfamiliar terrain. We are looking at a future that is different from what we have been comfortable with. Facing the unknown can indeed arouse fear and sense of helplessness, hopelessness, confusion, and so on. The situation in the world in general and of church in particular, church in India in particular, is one of pandemic and chaos. The major mission of the church, I would argue, is to help people find God and make sense of happenings in their life. And this God experience can come when we follow a pilgrim spirituality, one of being constantly alert, willing to leave familiar and comfortable surroundings. In such a pilgrimage, we have seen that awareness at multiple levels is required. Awareness of God's presence or apparent absence, awareness of how God works in the world, awareness of our own helplessness and fragility, greater consciousness of spirit filled life, etc. And here the aspect of spiritual discernment assumes greater importance, and we know that it requires humility, a sense of humility in a way that I'm open to listen to the other, look at their viewpoint, and search for what God is trying to communicate. A pilgrim is the one who is in search, the one who is on the move, one who is not attached to or stuck with the less important or the less good that matters when we are in search of something. Thus, we are to discern and to decide what is truly important as people of faith, as people who live spirit actually. Thank you.